Hey everyone, welcome to my next console retrospective. Today I'm going over one of my favorite consoles, one of the consoles that few people know about. That is the Sega Saturn. I myself was actually never into the Saturn when I was a kid. I was a PlayStation guy, I was never huge into Sega, so I really didn't even know much about it other than to see a couple titles at rental stores. But as the years went on, a friend of mine decided to get rid of his Saturn collection and just kind of gave it off to me. And he gave me it with some great games, and I just started a love for the system. I picked up a lot of these games when they were affordable. Like, to get some of these games now, it's really crazy how these prices have jumped up. So I really appreciate that he got me into it at a time when I could afford this stuff. So yeah, thanks to my buddy Matt if he's watching. The Sega Saturn is Sega's true follow-up to the Genesis. They did a couple half steps with the Sega CD and the 32X, and they had planned for a combined Genesis 32X in the Sega Neptune, but that was cancelled. But then the Sega Saturn came out, and that was the system that real Sega fans were waiting for. The development of the Sega Saturn began in 1992, and it was designed all around a new 2D chip by the company Hitachi. However, after Sony unveiled the PlayStation and showed off its 3D capabilities, the Saturn had to make a pivot at the last minute and include a 3D processor in their system. This was less than a year to launch, so it's pretty crazy that they managed to cram one in there that quickly. But the short amount of time that they had to do that engineering is the main reason that the Saturn's 3D capabilities don't look nearly as good as the PlayStation's. Sega also formed new dev teams to focus specifically on developing 3D games for their systems. The main one, and the most well-known, is Team Andromeda. The system released in Japan on November 22, 1994. There were 5 launch titles, but the only notable one is Virtua Fighter, which was a pack-in. The system sold really well, and it managed to sell out on launch day. In North America, the original launch date was scheduled for September 2, 1995. However, the execs at Sega Japan were starting to get really worried about the PlayStation and didn't want to launch the Saturn so close to that. So in May in 1995 at E3, Sega announced on stage after showing off the Saturn that it was immediately available for purchase. They had shipped a bunch of units to some of the department stores and you could go out and get those. That was a shock even to some of those big box retailers who had no idea. Sadly, the system didn't sell well at all in the US, and even in Japan after the PlayStation and the N64 came out, no one was really talking about the Saturn anymore, and it was kind of on its way out. Which is a shame because there were a ton of great games released for it, and Japan has even more great games that never came out over here. Sega tried hard to bring out great exclusives, but the last nail in the coffin for the system was when they cancelled Sonic X-treme, which was a game in development by Sega of America and one that they heavily promoted as a reason to get the system. The system was discontinued in 1998 and sold just under 10 million units worldwide. Now, if you've seen my retrospectives, I go through my collection, I go through the full library list of the console and find any notable games that are worth talking about, really interesting, that maybe I want to add to my collection or I just feel like talking about. Again, a lot of these picks are personal to me, so there may be some great games I don't know about that I just missed. Please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, there may be games here that you think are absolutely terrible, but I find notable, so please forgive me for those. In general, this is just a fun look at the system's library. I should mention, if you haven't seen my retrospectives before, I do focus on exclusive titles up front. I will get to multi-platform stuff later on. It's just that, it's hard to cover everything. A non-exclusive title may snuck in here for whatever reason. I'll try to mention when I talk about it, if that happens. It's also worth noting, though, for the Sega Saturn especially, most 3D multi-platform games are not worth it on the Saturn. You're better to get the PlayStation version of those. But most 2D games, especially fighters, are worth to get the Saturn versions. They are much better experiences. The Saturn was really designed as a 2D powerhouse, and Sony really didn't care about 2D gaming at the time. So it's worth checking out those games. Actually, the one game I have right here in my collection that isn't an exclusive, Marvel Superheroes, an amazing version of this game. All the Capcom fighters are way better on the Saturn. Also, the controller is much better suited to a 6-button fighter, so I recommend checking out those games. It's also worth noting that the Saturn had a lot of ports of Sega CD FMV games, so if that's your thing, there's a lot of those to check out on the Saturn. The quality was so bad on the Sega CD that this is actually a good way to play those, even though I don't think any of those games are really worth noting. One thing I have to mention, unlike my other retrospectives to this date, Saturn release dates are kind of up in the air. For the most part, I got a lot of the release dates, but some of them I only know what year they came out. So even though I'm trying to go in chronological order with this stuff, some stuff may not be exactly where it came out, so please keep that in mind. getting right into it, the US launched with 6 games, and some pretty great games. We got Panzer Dragoon, Clockwork Knight, Virtua Fighter, which was packed in, Daytona USA, Pebble Beach Golf Links, and Worldwide Soccer. So let's kick this off with the first game chronologically in my collection, Clockwork Knight. One of the first examples of a 2.5D platformer. Clockwork Knight is a cool game where you play this kind of toy wind-up knight who is traveling through his platform stages where the characters and enemies are these pre-rendered graphics, kind of like you'd see in Donkey Kong Country, but all the environments are in 3D. So you move through it like a typical 2D platformer. This effect has been done a lot recently, but it was pretty novel for the day. Right after that is Daytona USA, which I no longer have. I did have that in my collection, but actually I have the Dreamcast version, so I got rid of it. Again, if you don't know Daytona USA, it is a great Sega racing game. An arcade racer specifically. I think it's probably one of the best up there with the Cruisin' series. It only has 3 tracks, but they're a ton of fun, and it is just a real fun arcade racer. Right after that, another game I don't have because I have a superior version, which we'll get to later, Virtua Fighter. Again, if you don't know Virtua Fighter, this game was huge for the time. It came out in arcades. It was one of the first 3D fighters, and it looked goofy. I remember like everyone thinking it was real goofy at the time, but then when you saw it in motion, it was just really smooth. It was a really cool proof of concept, really, for how 3D fighters can work. And it's a pretty bare-bone experience. There's not a story mode or anything. It's just a good fighting game, so it's worth checking out if you want to see that kind of history of how the 3D fighters have evolved. The next game, the first game by Team Andromeda, showing off their 3D skills for the console. Panzer Dragoon is a really cool on-rails shooter. You fly a dragon. It takes place in this kind of futuristic, apocalyptic wasteland where, there was technology that was built at one point and it's all underground, but now everything is decimated, and there's an empire who is trying to unearth this technology and is become corrupted and trying to rule the world, and you fly on a dragon and take him out. It's basically the point of the game. There is 7 levels. It looks great. It plays great. If you have the Xbox game Panzer Dragoon Orta, you can play it in HD through that. But again, this is a really cool experience if you haven't seen Panzer Dragoon. Shortly after that, we got Duke Nukem 3D, which I originally picked up because I thought it was the only kind of close to uncensored console version, but in doing research I learned there's actually a PlayStation version, so that's probably a better version, but this is still a neat oddity. Again, it's Duke, so it is this mature rated first-person shooter that you wouldn't expect to see on consoles at the time. This one was rebuilt by a different developer, so I don't know how it holds up to the other version. It does feature a level that is exclusive to the Sega Saturn, so this Area 51 level you can play. It's also one of the games that supports Sega's Netlink, which is a pretty amazing thing for the Sega Saturn, that you could play games over a modem. You could buy the hardware and connect to a friend and play games with a friend. So this is one of the games that supported that, and it's really neat that that was available. The next game I want to mention is another one I don't have, but I did play it at one point, and it is called Robotica. It is a sci-fi first-person shooter that's not great, but not terrible. It's only worth mentioning because it is kind of a exclusive Saturn game that was, a first-person shooter developed exclusively for the Saturn. The game takes place on a space station that is 30 floors, and you basically fight your way through that. Right after that, we get to Virtua Hide Lide, which is a game I was excited to pick up and immediately resented getting it as soon as I popped it in my system. Hide Lide for the NES was a pretty bad RPG, and Virtua Hide Lide is actually a remake of that as a first-person RPG. So it tries to be something like an early Elder Scrolls, but it is just bad in every aspect. It is not fun to play. It is a rough game. It is notable just because it was this weird thing for the Saturn. It's actually still, I'm amazed that it came out and that it is what it is, and it's worth checking out if you want to see a really bad RPG. But yeah, it's just notable that it was a weird Saturn exclusive. Right after that is Virtua Racing, which is the Saturn port of the Sega arcade game that was also ported to Genesis, but Saturn is where you want to play it if you're into that. 3D racing games, so a racing game to be made with 3D polygons instead of just sprites. It's neat for the technology for the time, but probably not worth going back to now. Next up is Shinobi Legions, which is the last 2D game in the Shinobi series. This game is really interesting. The game uses that kind of pre-rendered style that Mortal Kombat uses. In this game, your katana is your main weapon, but your shurikens are not your main weapon. It plays a lot like Shinobi 3, so the gameplay is still tight and good, even though the graphics look quite a bit different. You can pick up items, you can pick up items to do special attacks. There's like FMV cutscenes. It's a pretty interesting game for Shinobi fans. That brings us to the only game I know of in the Saturn library that doesn't have a name on the spine, which is Astal. This is one of the games that my buddy gave me with the system, which is pretty cool because I probably wouldn't have thought to check it out on my own. It's a simple platformer, but it's beautiful looking. That's what makes it real special. The gameplay is pretty basic. It's your traditional platform, but the hand-drawn sprites are just, it's really cool looking. I highly recommend checking it out if you're into this kind of art style. Next up is a game I've been looking for a while, just out of curiosity, but never quite come across it, and that is Golden Axe The Duel. So this is the port of the third Golden Axe arcade game, which was a fighting game instead of a traditional beat-em-up. So this game had 11 different characters, and it was a one-on-one 2D fighter that is supposedly pretty bad, but I just need to see it for myself, so that's what I'm keeping my eye out for. And I think it's probably notable for being a Golden Axe game, and that's a series I think a lot of people wanted to continue after the Genesis and never did. And like a lot of games like Double Dragon and stuff, these famous beat 'em ups that you're excited for a next one and you get this kind of mediocre fighting game instead. It's a weird, notable thing. Right after that is a game called Wing Arms, which I also don't have because it's not really a kind of game I'm into, but it's still worth noting. It is a strange kind of mix of a flight sim and a kind of, aerial combat game. So it's not quite a total sim, it's not quite a total arcadey flight game, but it was recognized pretty well for just being a good combination of those two things. Next up is Dark Legend, which is a port of the Japanese 2D fighter game Outlaws of the Lost Dynasty by Data East. The game is set in China with 11 playable characters. It's not a great game, but it's an interesting exclusive. After that, the reason I don't own the pack-in Virtua Fighter Remix is a updated version of the original Virtua Fighter 1. The game just features updated graphics and gameplay, so it's very similar to the original Virtua Fighter, it just looks a bit better. The game was actually given out free to people who had registered their system with Sega through the mail. If you filled out the registration card when you bought your Saturn and sent it to Sega by a certain date, they would send you this in the mail on release. So that's a neat little thing. It was also available for purchase elsewhere, so I don't think it's that rare of a game, but it's an interesting note. The next game to talk about is Clockwork Knight 2, which is a follow-up to the first Clockwork Knight. It's pretty similar. Like, there are some levels where he rides a horse, but for the most part it's the same 2.5D platforming the first game was known for. It is a direct follow-up to the cliffhanger from the end of the first game, so if you were into that story, now you can see what happens next. Other than that, they introduced a boss rush mode, and it's the last game in the series because Clockwork Knight 3 for Saturn was cancelled, then a game that was proposed for GameCube was also cancelled. After that, we get to Hang-On GP 95. So Hang-On was a popular arcade motorcycle racing game by Sega. I really loved Hang-On and Super Hang-On, and this is the first 3D version of Hang-On. And it's pretty decent, so it's worth checking out if you're a fan of Hang-On. Right after that, we get a really interesting title, Battle Arena Toshinden Remix. So this is an updated version of the PlayStation game Battle Arena Toshinden. I believe it was in development at the same time. It features a new character and a new story mode. I just feel like this one's worth mentioning because I feel like the Toshinden series was very much a PlayStation thing, and it's weird to know that there was a Saturn version. Next up, if you're into light gun shooters, one you must have, Virtua Cop. Probably one of the first big light gun shooters in arcades. I know there's a ton of stuff before, but this is the first one that I remember really resonating with. I love it. It is such a fun little cop shooting game. Whereas older light gun shooters were FMV based, for some reason the primitive 3D just really does a lot here, and it's just a cool game. I really dig it. Again, it is just a simple light gun shooter, but worth checking out. It also supported the Saturn stunner gun, So there's a ton of guns. I think I have a Scorpion gun that works on Saturn and PS1, which is what I used to play these games. So a couple more games I don't have coming up. First is Sega Rally Championship. If you know Sega Rally, you probably know it from the Dreamcast sequel, Sega Rally 2. It is an arcade racing game, but it is rally racing, so it's a different style of racing from games like Daytona. It is a cool game focusing on drifting. Again, it doesn't really hold up if you have the Dreamcast one, but it's still a cool thing that it came out at this time for the Saturn. Right after that is a game I bought early on and then I sold off because I wasn't really interested in it and didn't realize how much it was worth. So, that's one of the pitfalls of collecting, is always know what you got. Blazing Heroes, which is a pretty neat 3D tactics RPG. It was called Ringlord Saga in Japan, and in the game you build up a party of 12 members and you go into tactics battles. Character recruitment is optional, so again, I haven't played this since way back when I first had it, but that sounds kind of like Shining Force, which I really dig. That idea of, hey, you might get this character, you might not get this character. Like, it's worth exploring the world to get extra characters for your army, and that really adds a lot of depth to these tactics games where it's usually just map after map. That brings us to Guardian Heroes, which is a pretty incredible beat 'em up by Treasure. It is a beat 'em up that has a ton of RPG elements. So you level up, you get items, you use different weapons and items. It is just a wicked beat 'em up. It's pretty expensive and hard to get now, so I recommend checking the Xbox 360 port that's out. It is really cool. If you like games like Castle Crashers or those Dungeons and Dragons arcade games, it's kind of like that, but it's Treasure, so they just do an amazing job with it. The game has 3 different lanes you move between, so you don't have the complete freedom of a traditional beat 'em up, but it really works for the amount of characters and bad guys on the screen. There are branching paths, which add a lot to the replayability, and this version includes a 6-player battle mode. So if you have the multi-tap, you can bring in 5 other friends and you all go at it. It is a pretty cool game. That brings us to Virtua Fighter 2, which is probably the most popular. Like, this game blew up. I mean, the whole series is great. Virtua Fighter are great fighting games, but I think if anyone played Virtua Fighter, this is the one they played in the arcades or on home ports. I mean, this thing was even ported to the Genesis, which could not handle it, but they tried. Everything is a step up from Virtua Fighter 1. The graphics, the gameplay, everything is just a little better. There are 2 new characters. Again, just another great, smooth 3D fighting experience for the time. Going right into another fighting game I don't have, but definitely worth mentioning, Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge. This is Darkstalkers 2, but I believe this console port was exclusive to the Saturn. So PlayStation got Darkstalkers 1 and 3, Saturn got Night Warriors. Another game I got rid of at some point just because it's not a great game for me, but it is definitely worth noting, is Gun Griffin. So I think this is the first in this mech series, a game kind of like Mech Warrior, put out by Working Designs. Again, not really up my alley, but a cool game, and I know there's a lot of Working Design fans out there that try to collect everything they put out. Which brings us to another amazing sequel, Panzer Dragoon 2. This game improved everything on the first game. The graphics are better, the controls a little tighter. There's multiple branching paths now, so more replayability to the game, and your dragon evolves based on your performance. So again, just more reasons to replay the game, which is great for these linear games. Alright, so I know this is a multi-platform game and probably better on the PlayStation, but D is an adventure game that it's one of those, it's like a Myst kind of puzzle game, except you have a time limit. So you have an hour, I think it's an hour, to get through this kind of hospital that's turned into Dracula's castle. You play this girl Laura, and the reason I'm bringing this up in the Saturn retrospective is that Laura was designed as a digital actress by the company that made this game. So she was designed to be a character that they could quickly drop into other games and build this kind of brand of, she's not the character in the game, she is an actress playing that character, and so she can do lots of games. And maybe that was just a cheap way for them to try and save money in the future by using the same model all the time. But the reason I'm talking about D here is because the sequels are Sega exclusive, so we'll get to those. After that, we have Darius Gaiden, which is the third entry in the horizontal shoot-'em-up series. The game has 28 stages and 2-player co-op. It's a great entry in that series and worth checking out if you're into shoot-'em-ups. It was also available on the Xbox and PS2 version of Taito Legends 2. Next up is another Working Designs game, which is not great, but still really interesting, and because it's Working Designs, it's worth mentioning, which is Iron Storm. This is a military-style tactics game where you move your armies on a hex grid. It features different troops and vehicle squads, and when you engage the enemy, you'll see a scene of the squads attacking each other instead of the typical one-on-one. Next up, a game I was looking for a long time that I only found very recently, Shining Wisdom. Part of the Shining series, which is a series I love, and a series of wildly different RPGs. This is the first action RPG in this series, so a lot of the PS2 games that would come out later were probably based on this kind of design. The game is a top-down 2D action RPG where your combat abilities change depending on what items and orbs you've collected. So that's an interesting way to keep the combat fresh by switching it up every so often. The game is also considered a kind of sequel to Shining Force 2. It has some direct connections to that game, so that's cool if you're into the lore of the Shining series. Next up, I want to mention Galaxy Fight, which is only really notable for me because for this channel, that was the first video we ever put out, was a Let's Play of the PlayStation version of Galaxy Force, which we never knew came out over here for Saturn. So, that's a personal pick. Let me indulge a bit. Following that is a very interesting game built on the Virtua Fighter 2 engine, which you'll hear about a lot. Virtua Fighter Kids. This is a really weird kind of chibi version of the game. I guess Street Fighter had Pocket Fighter, so this is the Virtua Fighter equivalent. The game is based on the arcade version. Like I said, it plays very much like Virtua Fighter 2, just with these big head chibi looking characters. But what's interesting about the Saturn port is that it contains a bunch of FMV cutscenes, which is really cool for the time, because I don't think any of the Virtua Fighter games up to this point have ever had any story or cutscenes or anything. Next up is, I would say, Yuji Naka's Saturn masterpiece, Nights into Dreams. Because we didn't have a great Sonic game for the Saturn, this is maybe the most important first-party game on the system. It is a really cool game where it's hard to describe, but you're kind of flying through this level in one direction, and you can do these different maneuvers to try and collect the gems in the stage, and you attack enemies, and you're just trying to get through this level. And as you loop around the stage, you're trying to get everything. Its gameplay is really interesting. It's really fun. Unfortunately, the sequel didn't really live up to it. It's a cool, short little action game that's worth checking out. It's really unique. Some versions of this game were also bundled with the 3D control stick. So it's it's a big bulky controller that kind of looks more like the Dreamcast controller. It's got an analog stick on it, which a lot of games actually support. I was actually amazed to see games as early as Duke Nukem 3D support this thing. So it's really cool to see that, a lot of these games had analog support long before the PlayStation had an analog stick. This brings us to another string of games I don't have here, but one that I'm really interested in that I've never heard about before, and that is called Mr. Bones. Again, I only found out about this because I went through the library, and I'm really interested to check it out now. This is a game that stars a villain who has a magical drum that brings skeletons back to life, and he uses those skeletons in his army. But one of the skeletons he brings back, Mr. Bones, has free will and doesn't want to join his army, and instead fights against them. So it's a really fun premise. What makes it cool is that it sounds like every stage is completely different. So one stage is a platformer, one stage is a rhythm game, the other stages are all different mini games that have different control schemes. It just sounds like something that I would totally enjoy, so I'm looking forward to checking that out. Right after that is Fighting Vipers, which is another 3D fighter by Sega, built on the Virtua Fighter 2 engine. I kind of dismissed this game for a long time because I have Virtua Fighter 2, I don't need some other game, but it sounds really interesting. It's notable because it's one of the first 3D fighters, if not the first one, to include a training mode, so this feature that would become really important for competitive play and to help people get better, that was been utilized in tons of games moving forward. It's neat to see that, that's something that may have started here. Next up is Tempest 2000, which is considered by fans to be one of the best in the series. Mostly you hear about the Jaguar version, so I didn't even know there was a Saturn version until I started looking this stuff up, but because the Jaguar is more obscure than the Saturn, this is probably the easier way to check it out. Next up is a game that I didn't know came out. I was actually surprised to see this came out in North America because I had never seen it before, but it is called Battle Arena Toshinden Ultimate Revenge Attack, or URA for short. This is a game, again, I was surprised that the first Toshinden came out here, and I thought that was a one-off, but this is kind of a take on Battle Arena Toshinden 2, but it's actually an alternate sequel to Battle Arena Toshinden. So like Battle Arena Toshinden, it's this kind of floaty 3D fighter that's really fun, but it maybe doesn't hold up quite so well now. So like I said, it's an alternate sequel to Battle Arena Toshinden 2, which means it kind of uses the same designs as Battle Arena Toshinden 2, but all the stages are different, the story mode is completely different, and 4 characters have been removed and a new 4 characters added. So it almost is like a different version of Battle Arena Toshinden 2, and if you're a fan of Toshinden, it's probably something you want to check out. Next up, the big Sonic game for the system, and one I don't have here because honestly I just hate it, and that is Sonic 3D Blast. After Sonic Extreme was cancelled, they needed something to fill that gap, so they brought this out here. It's kind of a port of the Genesis version, which itself is kind of more of a flicky game with Sonic thrown in. So in the game you play as Sonic on this kind of isometric world, and you roll around trying to get all the birds in the stage. It's not fun, it's interesting, it's just not a game I'm into, but I'm sure it has its fans. Right after that is Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition. So this is just an updated version of Daytona USA. For the most part, the big change is they added 2 more tracks to it. So now you can play 5 tracks instead of 3. One really interesting thing about this game is that a different version was released. And I don't know exactly when that version was released because of the release date issue, but this is called Daytona USA CCE Netlink Edition, and this is basically an online version of the Championship Circuit Edition that you play through Sega Netlink, and it is, I believe, the rarest game on the Sega Saturn. A lot of people don't really know about it because you could only get it through Sega's online store, and the internet wasn't what it was in '94. A lot of people weren't going online and shopping back then, so not many people probably got it. I know it is pretty hard to come by, and when it is, it's wicked expensive. So again, this is something that has true collector value, but probably not worth playing at all at this point. Just play the other editions, or play the Dreamcast version if you're really into Daytona. Lastly, on November 1996, so probably gearing up for that holiday season, they included 3 games bundled with a Saturn. This is called the 3 free games with purchase of a Sega Saturn disc, and it includes Virtua Fighter 2, Virtual Cop, and Daytona USA. Now we get to talk about one of my favorite arcade games from the 90s, Virtua On Cyber Troopers. If you never saw this thing in arcades, it was awesome. It was a 2-person cabinet. Each person had their own cockpit with 2 joysticks, which had triggers and buttons on top, and that was all you needed. And based on the directions you turned the sticks would control which direction you moved in, if you turned or strafed, if you jumped, I believe, and you had your different attacks on the triggers, and it was just this really fun one-on-one robot arena combat game. Definitely worth checking out. Next up, a game that not a lot of people know about, but it's really interesting. It's Dark Savior, and it's an isometric action-adventure game. It's basically this weird kind of isometric platforming game with puzzles. It is considered the spiritual successor to Landstalker on the Genesis, which a lot of people love. So if you're into Landstalker and have never heard of this is a game you need to check out. One really interesting thing about the game is it features branching paths that are determined based on how long it takes for you to complete an objective. So it's worth going through a couple times to see how it's different. Next up is a game I only have the disc for, which is Dragon Force, which is a really interesting mix of like a strategy simulation game and a real-time strategy game. In the game, you control these units that you move around a map until you run into other enemy units. And when you do, you can try to be diplomatic and talk to them, or you can just fight, and it's pretty notable for the amount of units you can have on screen at a time. So during those real-time segments, up to 200 units can be on screen, which is pretty crazy. Right after that is a game that's in a genre I'm not into, but it's definitely worth mentioning, which is called Heir of Zendor, The Legend and the Land. And this is a Koei strategy sim game. Koei is famous for these games. Things like Romance of the Three Kingdoms or was Uncharted Waters, or Nobunaga's Ambition. These are deep strategy simulation games where you kind of build up an empire. What makes this one stand out is that it's a Saturn exclusive and it's a sci-fi game that takes place on a number of planets. It sounds pretty interesting. Following that, another game I have disc only, even though I've been looking for a box version for a while, The Legend of Oasis, which is the follow-up to the Genesis action RPG Beyond Oasis, which is hugely popular. I don't think this one was as well received, but it is still a really cool game. It is just like that, a top-down action RPG set in an Arabian land, and it was originally planned for the 32X, but cancelled and brought out on the Saturn. Next up is Virtua Cop 2, so just a sequel to Virtua Cop, more levels, better graphics, faster gameplay. I don't know what else to say about it. It is just another on-rail light gun shooter that is really fun. Right after that is a game called Decathlete, which is a decathlon arcade video game put out by Sega. So this is a port of that game. Those kinds of track games aren't usually something worth mentioning, but I feel like a arcade-ish version developed by Sega might be something worth looking into. That brings us to a really interesting title, which is Christmas Nights. So you may remember I talked about Nights into Dreams a couple minutes ago. Christmas Nights is this free sampler that came with a magazine, and it includes a new storyline and one level from this game that has been updated graphically to have a Christmas theme. You play through that stage with each of the characters, which is interesting because in the original game you only play through that stage with one of the characters, and it's all Christmas themed, and there's a Christmas story, and it's neat. And one of the coolest things about it is that this stage changes depending on what your clock is set to on your Saturn and what day it is. So if certain holidays, different things will be shown, like April Fool's or Christmas obviously, and depending on the time of day, things will look a little different. So it's definitely something worth checking out if you can get your hands on it. The US one is pretty pricey, the Japanese version is dirt cheap, so if you don't mind not understanding the story, that might be a good way to go. There's a ton of unlockables in it, just like gallery stuff for sound stuff, and most notably a mode that you can play as Sonic, so that's pretty neat. And that is it for 1995-1996. Stay tuned for part 2, which is a little bit shorter, but we'll cover the remaining 2 years of the Saturn's lifespan. Thanks for checking out this video, subscribe for updates on more retrospectives, and I'll see you next time.